September 3, 1818. Subject Isaac. Offense, the sound of breath after exertion. Punishment, 30 lashes. August 14, 1818. Subject Old Ben, age 60. Offense, wheezing in the master's presence. Punishment, banishment to the swamp quarters. July 2, 1818. Subject Marie, age 16. Offense, audible respiration while waiting in the hall. Punishment, 15 lashes. You are listening to the contents of a disciplinary log found in the Louisiana Delta. There are no crimes listed here in the traditional sense. There are no thefts, no acts of violence, no rebellions. Instead, you are hearing the documentation of a madness so specific, so clinical, and so terrifying that it defies the logic of history. In this ledger, human beings were whipped, starved, and tortured, not for refusing to work, but for the biological necessity of drawing air into their lungs. This is the story of the Cypress Hollow Plantation. It is a story about the obsession of one man, Armand St. James, who decided that he was not just a master of men but a master of nature itself. He believed he could legislate silence. He believed he could own the very soundscape of his world, and to achieve that absolute quiet, he turned a sprawling plantation into a laboratory of psychological horror, a place where a cough could be a death sentence, and where the walls themselves were padded to catch the screams of the dying. My name is Elias Thorne, or rather, that is the name of the man who found the book, and what follows is the account of what he discovered when he walked into the house that silence built. The year was 1825. It was October, the month when the oppressive heat of the Louisiana summer finally begins to break, replaced by a damp, clinging fog that rolls off the Mississippi River and settles in the hollows of the cane fields. Elias Thorne had been sent from Baton Rouge to inventory the estate of the late Armand St. James. Elias was young, only 28 years old, a junior clerk for a bank that held the mortgage on the sprawling Cypress Hollow property. He was a man of ink and arithmetic, accustomed to the grim bureaucracy of his profession. He counted acres, he counted livestock, and, with the dispassionate detachment of the time, he counted human beings. He thought he knew what to expect. He had seen the brutality of the plantation system before. He knew about the whipping posts, the iron collars, the families separated at auction blocks. He had learned to steel himself against the reality of what he cataloged, viewing the world through the safe, dehumanizing lens of a ledger sheet. But he was not prepared for Cypress Hollow. The first thing Elias noticed was the atmosphere. Most plantations were hives of activity, the shouting of overseers, the clatter of wagons, the distant singing from the fields, the barking of dogs. But as Elias rode up the long, oak-lined drive to the main house, he realized that Cypress Hollow was different. It was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a church, but a heavy, suffocating silence. The birds seemed to avoid the trees near the house. The wind moved through the Spanish moss without a sound. Even the gravel on the drive seemed to swallow the noise of his horse's hooves. The house itself was a grand structure, built in the French Creole style with wide galleries and tall windows, but the shutters were drawn tight. It sat like a tomb in the middle of the overgrown garden. Elias entered the library, the room where he would spend the next 2 weeks of his life. It smelled of stale tobacco smoke and something sweeter, like rotting magnolias. On the mahogany desk, sitting alone in a pool of dust, was the ledger. It was bound in pigskin, cracked and mildewed from the relentless humidity. Elias sat in the dead man's chair and opened it, expecting to find financial records, columns for cotton bales, sugar yields, or supply costs. Instead, he found the disciplinary log I read to you a moment ago. He read the entry for Isaac again, breathing too loudly. Elias assumed at first that it must be a metaphor. Perhaps loud breathing was a euphemism for sighing or muttering under one's breath, an act of perceived insolence. Masters were known to punish attitude as severely as action, but as he continued to turn the stiff, crackling pages, the pattern became undeniable and terrifyingly literal. There were 6 entries specifically citing loud breathing, audible respiration, or failure to suppress cough within a 4-month period in 1818. 6 human beings punished, beaten, and in one case exiled, simply for existing. Elias looked up from the book. He looked out the window at the moss-draped oaks. The 84 enslaved people listed in the property inventory were working in the sugar cane fields a mile away, out of sight and earshot. But the house felt crowded with the ghosts of 1818. What kind of man punishes a person for breathing? And what kind of house requires absolute, tomb-like silence from the people who keep it running? Elias didn't know it yet, but he was holding the evidence of a psychological descent that had turned this house into a machine designed to erase the evidence of human life. Elias spent the next 3 days at Cypress Hollow, ostensibly inventorying furniture and silver, but in reality, he was investigating the history of that strange year, 1818. He needed to understand the mind of Armand St. James. He found his first clue not in the papers, but in the architecture of the house itself. While inspecting the servants' pantry, a narrow space connecting the kitchen to the dining room, Elias noticed something peculiar about the floor. In every other room of the house, the floors were hardwood, polished oak or cypress that creaked with the natural settling of the building. But in the pantry, and in the long hallway leading to the master bedroom, the floors were different. They were covered in thick, heavy felt. It wasn't a rug. It was industrial-grade material, nailed down with brass tacks along the baseboards. Elias knelt to examine it. It was worn, stained with years of traffic, but its purpose was immediately clear. St. James had modified his home to eliminate the sound of footsteps. He wanted his servants to appear and disappear, like smoke. As Elias walked the house, he began to see the obsession everywhere. The doors to the service areas had been fitted with heavy leather pads to prevent them from clicking when latched. The hinges were greased with a thick, peculiar animal fat that resisted drying out. The bell system used to summon servants was not a ringing bell, but a series of colored flags that dropped silently in the kitchen, signaling a demand without breaking the quiet. The house had been engineered for silence. It was a physical manifestation of St. James's pathology. But engineering wasn't enough for St. James. He needed to engineer the people too. On his 4th day, Elias rode out to the fields to speak with the overseer, a man named Silas Vane. Vane was a rough man, scarred and sun-weathered, a man who viewed Elias with the contempt practical men often hold for bankers and clerks. But Vane answered to the bank now, so he answered Elias' questions. The conversation that followed chilled Elias to the bone. When Elias showed him the ledger and asked about the punishments for breathing, Vane didn't laugh. He didn't look surprised. He simply spat tobacco juice onto the dry earth and looked toward the distant house. "No code," Vane said, his voice flat. "Mr. St. James, he had particular requirements." Elias pressed him. "Requirements?" Vane explained that St. James didn't like noise. It wasn't just a preference, it was a physical revulsion. He didn't like the sound of work. He didn't like the sound of life. He wanted things done by magic, as near as Vane could tell. He wanted dinner to appear on the table without hearing the footsteps of the person bringing it. He wanted his wine poured without hearing the glug of the bottle or the breath of the steward. "He whipped a man for breathing," Elias said, pointing to the entry for Isaac. "He whipped Isaac for panting," Vane corrected, as if the distinction made it rational. Isaac had run up the stairs to fetch a cloak. He was out of breath. He stood by the door, trying to catch his wind quietly. Mr. St. James heard him, said it was animalistic, said it disturbed his concentration, ordered 10 lashes to teach him control. "And the others, Marie, old Ben." Vane shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable for the first time. Marie had a cold. She sniffled while she was holding the door. St. James couldn't abide sickness sounds, and Ben had asthma. He wheezed when the damp set in. St. James said the sound was like a bellows in a forge. He couldn't stand it, so he sent him to the swamp camp. The swamp camp was a shack on the edge of the Cypress break. It was where they put the ones who were too loud, or too old, or too sick. Ben died out there 2 weeks later, alone in the mud. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. This wasn't just cruelty. Cruelty was common in the Delta. This was a specific, manic erasure. Armand St. James hadn't just wanted slaves, he wanted automata. He wanted the labor of human beings without the evidence of their humanity. The sound of breath, of a heartbeat, of a sniffle, these were reminders that the property was alive, that it suffered, that it existed, and St. James could not tolerate that reminder. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The silence of the house, which he had initially found peaceful, now felt oppressive. He imagined the people who had moved through these halls 7 years ago, Isaac, Marie, Sarah, holding their breath until their lungs burned, stepping carefully on the felt-lined floors, terrified that an involuntary bodily function would result in torture. He returned to the library, lighting a single candle against the encroaching dark. He began searching for correspondence. He needed to hear the voice of the man who had created this hell. He found a bundle of letters from 1818, written by St. James to a cousin in Paris. The handwriting was jagged, pressing hard into the paper, revealing a mind under immense pressure. In a letter dated September 20, 1818, St. James wrote, "My dear Philippe, I have finally achieved a measure of peace here at Cypress Hollow. The noise of this country, the insects, the river, the brute sounds of the labor force has always been an agony to me, but I have instituted new protocols. I have taught them that silence is the highest virtue. They move now like shadows. It is delightful. I can sit in my study for hours and hear nothing but the turning of a page. It is as if I am alone in the world, served by invisible hands." Served by invisible hands. That was the key. St. James didn't want to be a master of people. He wanted to be a magician served by spirits, and he was willing to break human bodies to achieve that illusion. But as Elias read on, the tone of the letters shifted. By October, the satisfaction was gone, replaced by paranoia. "They are mocking me," St. James wrote. "I know they are. I can hear them breathing, even when they are in the other room. I can hear the air moving in and out of their wretched lungs. It is a scratching sound, a rasp. It penetrates the walls. I have added felt to the floors, but it is not enough. They are breathing louder on purpose. They are doing it to break my peace." The madness was escalating. St. James was no longer reacting to loud noises. He was hallucinating sounds, or focusing on them with such intensity that they became deafening to him. He was trapped in a feedback loop of his own psychosis, and the people enslaved under him were paying the price. But the ledger had an abrupt end. The entries stopped in November 1818. Elias searched for a reason. Had St. James grown bored? Had he died? No, St. James had died only weeks ago in 1825. So what happened in late 1818 to stop the punishments? Elias found the answer in the parish courthouse, records the next day. He rode into St. Landry Parish and requested the death records for 1818. The clerk handed him a dusty volume, and Elias ran his finger down the columns of names. There was a cluster of deaths recorded for Cypress Hollow in November of that year. November 12, Isaac, male, age 22, cause fever. November 14, Sarah, female, age 19, cause fever. November 15, Marie, female, age 16, cause fever. 3 of the people named in the ledger, the ones punished for breathing, for eye contact, for existing too loudly, had died within 3 days of each other. The official cause was fever, a catch-all term in the 19th century that could mean yellow fever, malaria, or typhoid. But when Elias cross-referenced these deaths with the plantation's purchase records, he found something strange. On November 20, 1818, exactly 1 week after the deaths, Armand St. James had purchased 6 new enslaved people from a trader in New Orleans. The notation next to the purchase in St. James's personal financial log read, "Replacement stock, specifically requested deaf mutes if available, trader unable to supply, settled for documented quiet temperament." Elias sat back in his chair, the horror washing over him. The fever might have been real, or it might have been a convenient cover for a purge. Had St. James eliminated the noisy ones? Had the punishments escalated from whippings to something final? There was no way to prove murder. The law in 1818 Louisiana gave a master absolute authority over his property, even if St. James had executed them for breathing too loudly. It would likely not have been considered a crime in the eyes of the law, merely a destruction of assets, but the financial records suggested he had simply discarded them as broken tools, and bought new ones he hoped would be quieter. Elias needed the truth. He returned to the plantation and sought out the only witness who might still be alive. He found an elderly woman named Hattie working in the laundry. She was listed on the inventory as 60 years old, which meant she would have been there in 1818. She was scrubbing sheets in a copper tub, her arms sinewy and strong, moving with a rhythm that seemed to defy her age. Elias approached her carefully. He told her he wasn't there to cause trouble. He just wanted to know about Isaac and Marie. Hattie stopped scrubbing. She didn't look up. She told him they were gone. "I know they're gone," Elias said gently. "The records say fever. Is that true?" Hattie kept her eyes on the soapy water. "Fever takes who it takes." "Did they have fever, Hattie?" She looked up then, and Elias saw a hardness in her eyes that made him step back. It was the look of someone who has seen things that cannot be unspoken. "Mr. St. James," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He had a special room in the cellar. He called it the quiet room." Elias felt the air leave the room. The quiet room. "Thick walls," Hattie said. "No windows. He put Isaac in there after the whipping didn't work. Said Isaac needed to learn to be still. Isaac was in there 4 days. When they brought him out, he was quiet, but he was coughing deep in his chest. Marie, too. She went in the quiet room because she hummed while she was sweeping, just a little hum. She didn't even know she was doing it. 3 days in the dark. It was cold down there, damp." "So the fever." "Pneumonia," Hattie said. "From the cold floor, from the damp. They got sick in the quiet room. And he wouldn't let the doctor come because he said their coughing was too loud. He moved them to the barn so he wouldn't have to hear it. They died in the barn." It wasn't a purge, not exactly. It was neglect born of obsession. St. James had tortured them with isolation and cold to enforce silence, made them sick, and then allowed them to die because their dying breaths were too noisy for his delicate ears. Elias had to see it. He had to see the mechanism of this torture. He walked to the cellar. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron. He opened it, the hinges groaning in the stillness. The air inside was stagnant and cold, smelling of earth and old wine. He descended the stone steps with his lantern, the light dancing on the damp walls. The cellar was divided into storage rooms for wine and root vegetables, but in the back, hidden behind a stack of barrels, was a small, brick-lined chamber. It had a heavy wooden door with no handle on the inside. Elias stepped inside. The walls were lined with what looked like mattress ticking stuffed with cotton. It was crude, homemade soundproofing. The floor was bare stone. There was no ventilation, no light. If the door was closed, the darkness would be absolute. The silence would be suffocating. Elias stood in the center of the small room. He closed his eyes. He tried to imagine Isaac in here, shivering on the stone, afraid to cough, afraid to breathe, knowing that the man upstairs demanded his silence above his survival. He tried to imagine the terror of a darkness so complete that you begin to question your own existence. This was the true legacy of Cypress Hollow, not the columns, Not the sugar cane, not the wealth. It was this room, a room padded to muffle the screams of the dying, a room built to turn human beings into ghosts before they were even dead. Elias finished his inventory 2 weeks later. He sent the ledger to the bank in Baton Rouge along with the financial records. He included a note about the unusual disciplinary practices documented therein. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The bank didn't care about the cruelty of the previous owner. They only cared about the resale value of the land and the workforce. The plantation was sold in 1826 to a sugar conglomerate. The house stood for another 40 years until the Civil War, when it was burned by Union troops in 1863. The fire reportedly started in the cellar. Perhaps it was an accident, or perhaps someone finally decided to cleanse the earth of what had happened there. Elias Thorne never forgot what he read. He kept a personal copy of the ledger entries, transcribed into his own diary. He eventually left the banking profession and became a school teacher in Ohio, far away from the cotton and sugar fields. He spent the rest of his life surrounded by the noise of children, shouting, laughing, crying. He never complained about the noise. He welcomed it. To him, noise was the sound of freedom. But the ledger survived. It sat in a bank archive for nearly a century, mislabeled as Agricultural Records 18-18-1825. It wasn't until 1930, during a Works Progress Administration project to document Southern history, that a researcher named Beatrice Holt found it. She read the entries about the punishments for breathing. She thought it was a mistake, a joke, or a forgery. It seemed too absurdly evil to be real. But then she found the letters. She found the death records. She pieced together the story of Armand St. James and his obsession with silence. The ledger is now housed in a university archive in New Orleans. It is a small, unassuming book, resting on a metal shelf in a climate-controlled room. But if you were to go there, and if you were allowed to open it to the year 1818, you would feel the terror rising off the pages. You would see the entry for September 12, 1818. Subject: unknown child, age 5. Offense: crying after stubbing toe. Punishment: the quiet room, 24 hours. A 5-year-old child, locked in a dark padded room, for crying. This story forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the past. We often think of history in terms of great movements, wars, laws, economies, but history is also personal. It is shaped by the specific, individual psychologies of the people who held power. Slavery created a space where the specific madness of a master could become the absolute law for hundreds of people. Armand St. James was a man disturbed by sound. In any other society, he might have been a grumpy neighbor or an eccentric recluse. In the society of the antebellum South, he was a god. He had the power to legislate the breathing of other human beings. The 6 people punished for breathing: Isaac, Sarah, Marie, Thomas, Old Ben, and the unnamed child are gone. Their graves are unmarked, lost under the Louisiana mud. There is no monument to them. There is no plaque at the site of the old plantation. But the ledger remains. It is a testament to a time when a breath could be a crime, and silence was enforced with the whip and the tomb. We tell this story not because it is comfortable. It is not. We tell it because it is true, and because somewhere in the silence of that archive, the breathing of those 6 people can finally be heard. If you listen closely to the past, you don't just hear the speeches of presidents or the cannons of war. You hear the small, terrified breaths of people trying to survive in a world designed to crush them. And it is our duty, as the living, to make sure those breaths are never silenced again. This has been the story of the silent plantation. If you found this history compelling, if it made you think about the value of the freedoms we take for granted, even the freedom to breathe loudly, then I ask you to share this story. History is only lost if we refuse to look for it. Until next time, keep listening.